All right, students in Film 342, film genre, science fiction film, welcome to our first Mailbag offered as a podcast. It's closed captioned in YouTube. If you want to read it, I recommend putting it on while you run some errands or go for a walk. We'll start off with Samantha. What was the first film developed that was no longer a silent film? Well, that will be 1927, Al Jolson in The Jazz Singer. That said, Thomas Edison had been experimenting with synchronic sound as early as the turn of the 20th century, but in really complex and impractical matters for film distribution on an industrial scale with a phonograph and a film projector connected via a system of pulleys. Now, initially in 1927, the adoption of synchronic sound was sparse and used primarily for musical numbers. By 1929, however, the vast majority of films released began to be in sound, which led to an overhaul of the industry as theaters across the country frantically included speakers and developed the technologies for synchronic sound because audiences were no longer interested in silent film. The distribution of silent film dropped precipitously and became only an occasional novelty. Recent films like The Artist or Cargo, or our own science fiction films, more firmly situated in science fiction. 2001: A Space Odyssey opens with a long sequence without dialogue, and as you know, or as you will see soon, WALL-E 2 opens with a long sequence with no dialogue outside of a snippet of an old film that WALL-E watches. Samantha's next question is, when did the production of color films begin? Well, early filmmakers at the turn of the 21st century experimented with color, but that involved painting individual frames on the celluloid, which was not really practical for broad distribution of negatives being printed and then color being added. So various companies competed with color processing, and Technicolor won out. This took place in the 1930s. Notably, one of the kind of most significant films employing color in the 30s was Walt Disney's Snow White, which was the first feature-length animated film. It broke the record for all-time ticket sales and money made, and would hold that record until Gone with the Wind beat it out in 1939. Jessica asks, when directors, producers are creating science fiction films, is there a certain checklist they must go by in order for it to be considered science fiction? I understand from the textbook in Chapter 1, many movies are considered science fiction because of the technology, the futurism, and the set design used. I was just curious if any director could just call their film science fiction, or must it have those elements? That's a great question because it draws attention to the degree to which the makers of a work and the audiences of a work each have a stake in deciding what something is. Now, for a film like, say, Transformers 37, I imagine the production matrix does go through a checklist. Do we have a rugged, relatively young male star? Do we have an attractive woman that he meets who becomes a foil and fellow? Do we have giant robots punching each other out in exciting locations? So in that instance, the technology and the set design are crucial. That said, a filmmaker can call something anything he or she wants to call it, but that doesn't make it what that is. Audiences have a stake in determining what a film is, whether it's science fiction or not. And this is where really exciting critical conversations emerge. Critics can debate for weeks whether the original Star Wars, or indeed the entire franchise, are science fiction or science fiction/fantasy. IMDb calls them both and calls them other things as well, positive terms. So, Johnston's claim that science fiction film is determined by its emphasis on technology as its object, a view to the future, and employing set designs that construct that future. That's his argument. It's a powerful one because of the degree to which it is applicable. Other arguments could be persuasive but less applicable. The more narrowly defined the argument and the more narrow films it describes, well, in some instances, the less valuable that argument. Alright, now we'll go to Asia. While watching Voyage to the Moon, I noticed scenes in the film that were absolutely unrealistic, even for a science fiction movie. For example, the scene when the actors arrived to the moon and laid down to take a nap with no disruption from the lack of gravity. I understand the time period was 1902 and the first actual human interaction with the moon was many years later, but my question is, were film writers during that time actually not educated and had only their imagination to rely on to create the film? Or was it a lack of technology that would be able to show special effects and more realistic perspective on an actual trip to the moon? That's a really smart question because it calls into question the degree to which the fantastic, as I'll offer it in our video cast for today, means something different from pure fantasy, pure imagination. And Georges Méliès, the director of Voyage to the Moon, was a magician of pure imagination. And I mean that literally. He was a magician. He saw film as a way to make his tricks more persuasive. He wasn't interested in what was really happening, and he would not have bothered reading any of the real books about science. This kind of leads into her follow-up question, which is, were scientific books during this time written the same unrealistic way as this film? And my first point would be that Newton's argument regarding physics was written, I believe, in the 1600s, the 17th century, and yet those same principles were the basis for the United States landing a man on the moon. Because Newtonian physics works in the macroscopic world, doesn't work at the subatomic world. Yet, even today, we can find pseudoscientific works written. And so absolutely there were pseudoscientific works claiming to be science, but being extraordinarily unrealistic. We should turn to Voyage to the Moon to get a scientific understanding, no more than we should read a physics textbook to be entertained. Cheryl's question is, pertaining to Metropolis, who is the real villain in this film? I thought it was John Frederson's father that did not want the workers to know the real reason of why they were building the Tower of Babel. Then the story looks like it took a turn, and now Rotwang the inventor seems like the villain. It was going in the direction of a love story between John and Maria, then it took another turn. I was curious as to what happens to the brother and why he was working in the depths. What is your take? Well, Cheryl, that's a great question because it points out the degree to which Fritz Lang was making what he felt at the time would be his magnus opus. He went on to make far more extraordinary films in terms of their tight construction, but this is a giant, sprawling film, and it speaks to some other remarks I make in the vidcast regarding the combination of genres. Yeah, this is a love story, and at times it's a horror story. It's science fiction, and it's a political indictment of class difference. So what works here is by having Rotwang the inventor serve as such a unredeemable villain that John Frederson is able to reach his father and get his father to understand that we must unite the heart and the hand. So, as such, Rotwang being so despicable makes John Frederson's father redeemable. Recognize the degree to which that serves the power structure. Jamishet remarks, after watching the short film Cargo, I thought of it more as a horror film than a science fiction film. So what separates the two genres? This is something else I address in the video cast, that science fiction and horror are at times so tightly intertwined that John Belton in his book American Cinema, American Culture includes them in the same chapter. Many horror films and science fiction films deal with the relationship of the self and the other. Most often in the horror film, the self recognizes the other and may be literally penetrated by it, but must cast it out. Think in terms here of films of possession, right? That The Exorcist, any of the films about exorcism and possession, demonic possession, the demon must be cast out, the other must be cast out. Whereas science fiction, in instances that are not delving into horror, the engagement of self and other takes on sort of a greater matter of either reconciliation or the decision for mutual difference. Portia asks, was music the only way to interpret what was going on in silent films? since they didn't use dialogue? Well, that depends. The grandest of the silent films of the beginning with the feature-length epics of 1914-15 and slightly thereafter until the advent of sound in 1927, only at the largest epic film releases would there be an orchestral score and an orchestra to play. At many of the smaller films, it would just be a person playing the piano, sometimes with no score at all, and just, okay, this is an action scene, I'll play a major chord really fast. Oh, this is a sad scene, I'll play a minor chord very slowly. There were the use of intertitle cards that would feature dialogue. However, since silent films were distributed internationally, this presented some challenges because for different linguistic areas, we would need to edit the film and take out the intertitle that is in English and put one in French or vice versa. So to avoid relying on interrupting the visuals, and that's what the audiences were there to see, the visuals, the people moving on screen, because they hadn't seen that before. Remember, film was invented in 1895 and only became really widely distributed at the beginning of the 20th century. It was initially seen as a novelty and didn't really begin telling stories as its primary function until 1908. And until 1914-15, films were typically one reel long, 10 minutes. Only in the era of the emergence of the epic in 1914-15 did films start to stretch to 2.5 and 3 hours. So it wasn't just the intertitle cards, but a reliance on over-exaggerated acting. And we certainly see this in Metropolis, that these are actors trained on the stage, but a stage, the cheap seats way up there, they can't see your face, so you have to have these exaggerated movements, and this was expected of theatrical acting. And those actors who took to the film, they often weren't advanced theatrical actors because initially the theater saw film as an inferior medium. So these actors employed this well-understood language of body movement to convey feelings, sadness, anger, fear. When we watch it from our vantage point now, it seems ridiculous overacting, but just as we have to recognize that technological transformation lends itself to, well, greater production values. I mean, honestly, any contemporary film costing $40 million or more looks way, way better than Casablanca. But that doesn't mean it is way, way better than Casablanca, because films are more than just their production values. The money spent on, well, planning them, having extremely carefully done lighting, having a fantastic score, hiring beautiful people, that film can be far more than just how much money was spent and what technology was available to make it. And in this instance, think of Cargo. Most of my students that I show Cargo to find it a deeply moving film, and yet it features almost no dialogue. And honestly, 5 of us could get together on a weekend and shoot it on an iPhone. So we have to think in terms of what technology filmmakers have available to them at any given moment. Quentin asks, do you think every film genre has elements of science fiction in them? And this is a tricky question because it draws again attention to the degree to which we like to think of genres as distinct, but they're not. They're constantly overlapping. That Casablanca is a love story and a war film. So draw a distinction between Johnston's emphasis that science fiction focuses on technology and any film incorporating technology in it. So simply put, in the film Disclosure with Michael Douglas and Demi Moore, there's people banging away on computers, and there's at the time, visually arresting sequence where Michael Douglas uses a kind of virtual reality device to access files, but the film is not about technology. Any more than in The Revenant, starring Leonardo DiCaprio, there are rifles, and rifles are a technology. Heck, snowshoes are a technology. But is that technology merely present, or is it the object of inquiry for the plot? Does it help drive the plot? Is it the basis for conflict between characters? Does it become a dominant theme? And if not, then it may not be science fiction according to Johnston's terms unless it meets significantly two of the others. An emphasis on the future and the necessity of set designs that emphasize that. That said, if one said a film was set in 2300 after a horrific world nuclear war, and if it were a bunch of scavenging people in the hills dressed in rags, that one would be hard put to call that a science fiction film, just because it's set in the future. If the object of inquiry in the film is not defined by the future meaning anything, then what makes it different from, Clan of the Cave Bear?
Brittany asks, since technology and other topics related to science fiction are always evolving, does that mean the definition of science fiction changes over time? That's a tricky question. So first off, technology evolves over time, but it doing so doesn't mean that, say, for example, Voyage to the Moon is no longer science fiction. In the context of 1902, it absolutely was science fiction, even though now we've been to the moon and back. So we have to understand the text within the context of its production and reception. That said, I could imagine circumstances wherein the relationship of self and other would be dramatically transformed. So, for example, there's current research being done in neuroscience wherein somebody in a MRI machine and somebody outside of the MRI machine can communicate by having the person in the MRI machine think about certain activities like having tea with their grandmother, and then think about other activities like playing tennis. And if thinking of the grandmother and having tea lights up certain neurons in that person's brain that's visible via the MRI machine, and if thinking about playing tennis lights up different aspects of the person in the machine's brain, and if tea with the grandmother means yes, and playing tennis means no, well, this experiment's been conducted, and it worked, that the experimenter outside of the MRI machine could ask a series of questions, and by just looking at the response, what neural networks were firing, then they could get no or yes answers to their questions. This means down the line, we may be able to communicate without speaking, typing, any current act through thinking. We may be able to communicate through thinking. Similarly, I'm wearing contacts. Somebody has a prosthetic leg. But we may become increasingly indistinguishable from machines. These two matters mean that the distinction between self and other may transform tremendously over time. And for that future community, imagining people being separate and not rooted within machines might itself be science fiction. Sorry, that beep was my computer telling me that Chastity liked my email.
Charleston asks another great question. Could you clarify what the industrial perspective and industrial spectacle is? I understand that different people have different definitions of science fiction and what they think should be present, but what does the industry say these elements and themes are? Well, two things. The industry does not give a crap about what critics define science fiction as, because the industry sits around and tries to decide if we put $300 million in a pile to make Avengers 5, are we going to get our money back? And so their interests, those are in the end, that is the industry. Now, of course, looking at the market trends, once they decide they're going to commit that $300 million, then they typically hire the most successful people who have a track record most often, or Disney's doing something really interesting with its arm Lucasfilm in producing films within the Star Wars universe by hiring some directors. Obviously, J.J. Abrams has a long track record, but Rian Johnson does not. They hired two offbeat directors for the new Solo film, but grew uncomfortable with their work and pulled them off and put on Ryan Howard to do a straightforward, direct the way that we are telling you to. So the industry means lots of things. It means getting the money in a pile. It means really smart people like Kathleen Kennedy, who is Disney's head of Lucasfilm, for her to then further find really smart people and delegate to them and let them do their jobs. They do not go to the university library and consult books by Johnston or books by J.P. Talat. That said, they're approaching filmmaking and filmmaking in the context of science fiction inductively. They're looking at what's worked in the past, what do we feel like, what stories do we want to tell, what do we think will sell, whereas critics are taking a much sort of distant view, often a more critical view in both senses of pejorative, negative criticism, and also being critical of what are the various perspectives by which we can look at this. So, industrial spectacle emphasizes the degree to which a film looks like it's science fiction. So, films like Star Wars The Last Jedi looks like science fiction from its opening space battle. Sorry, spoiler, there's an opening space battle. Other films, however, like the, I think, very small film, not very well known, I think 2013, Primer, is a film that works very, very hard to make time travel realistic. And it's very low budget, and it's very dense, hard to follow, and it has no production values. Its plot and character are defined, and its themes, certainly, are defined within science fiction, but we don't see the elements of it there. We don't see that spectacle. We don't see the explosions, the spaceships. Cargo is a similar example of, sure, it's science fiction by virtue of, so far as I know, there is not a zombie apocalypse, but it's something that a lot of filmmakers have imagined in some future. So, and it also similarly lacks that industrial spectacle. So Cargo likely would not fit Johnston's definition of what constitutes a science fiction film, other than that emphasis on self and other, and that ambiguity, and then that clarity, and then that, what I find, an extremely heartrending ending. So the industrial perspective is, we need to put hundreds of millions of dollars on the screen so this looks different than what people have seen, or it looks the same as what they've seen but different enough that they'll spend another $12. The industrial perspective also knows that most movies will make more money overseas than they will make in the United States. And rich and dense dialogue about a tortured couple going through a divorce does not translate internationally. You know what does translate internationally? Giant robots punching each other. All right, that'll do it for today. I've enjoyed reading your questions. I loved making the video cast, which I'll post tonight. And have a great rest of the week. Week 2.2 will be posted tomorrow. And it's going to be a lot lighter than this week. This week was, first half is dense. There's a lot of material to read, and I understand that. And so the second half is a lot easier. My main emphasis this week is in you folks drafting and then revising your scene description and analyses. Please read the assignment as the question to which your paper is the answer, and very closely follow the models that I've offered. I know that way works. You can do it a different way, and it might work, but I know that way works. And it's an effort to get you to write within a very constrained format, which, honestly, in my years of being an administrator and working in industry and being a faculty member, writing in a very tightly constrained format is the way that writing proves successful often, fiction notwithstanding. All right, y'all. Have a great day.